The wind is cutting through the stone corridors of Chinon Castle, the way it always does in winter, like the fortress itself is breathing. Somewhere deep inside, the fire has shrunk to a dull bed of embers. The heat is barely holding on. And in the innermost chamber, King Henry II of England is holding on too. Not like a conqueror, not like the man who once moved armies across two kingdoms as if the world were a chessboard. Tonight, he looks like someone worn down by time, sickness, and the sheer weight of what he built. His skin is pale, his eyes are hollow. Every breath feels earned, like the air itself is reluctant to stay in his lungs. Beside the bed, on a heavy oak table, lies the map of the Angevin realm. Parchment darkened by candle smoke, edges curled from heat. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, names that once made men bow, names that once made kings think twice. But the markings on the map are wrong now. Not wrong in ink, but wrong in meaning. The red marks, the pins, the scratched notes, they don't just show enemies closing in, they show something worse. They show his own blood. For years, people whispered stories about the House of Anjou, that Henry's line wasn't entirely clean, that somewhere in the family legend there was a woman, beautiful, unsettling, who hated church bells, hated holy walls, and when she was forced to step into a sanctuary, she took two of her children and vanished through a window like smoke. A demon ancestor, the chroniclers called her. A campfire story. A convenient insult. Henry never needed myths. He needed laws. He needed order. But in the dark of Chinon, with the fire dying and the pain pressing down on his chest, even he can't help wondering, what if that story was never about demons at all? What if it was about inheritance, about the curse of being unable to belong anywhere, unable to be held, even by your own family? Henry closes his eyes. And immediately, the floor of Canterbury flashes behind his eyelids, cold stone, candlelight, and blood. He hears the echo of footsteps in a vast sacred space. He sees the face of Thomas Becket, friend, chancellor, archbishop, enemy, and then a saint. He opens his eyes again. He tries to swallow, and the motion hurts. He turns his head toward the table, toward the map, toward the one thing he always understood: territory, structure, rules. And that's when he senses it, a presence. In the corner of the room near the hearth, the shadows seem to thicken, the candlelight tremble, and in the chair by the embers, a figure sits as if he has always been there. Black cloak, hood low, still a stone. Henry stares, barely able to lift his chin. "I didn't call you," he manages, voice scraped raw. The figure answers without anger, without triumph, almost gently. "But your words," he says, "have always carried orders, even when you spoke them in a rage." Henry wants to deny it, to argue, to explain, that he never meant it for it to happen, that he didn't say, "kill him," that he didn't. But his lungs won't give him the strength for excuses. Then the door swings open. Torchlight spills across the floor, and someone steps into the chamber like a blade entering a sheath. Tall, armored, broad-shouldered. The air shifts as if it's making room for him. Richard. Henry knows, even before the figure reaches the bed, that this isn't simply Richard walking in from a corridor. Richard is far away out in the world of horses, fortresses, and war. This is something else. This is Richard as Henry remembers him, Richard as consequence, Richard as the shape of the future. The young man doesn't bow, he doesn't kneel. He looks down at Henry like a soldier looking at an old commander. "Father," Richard says, his voice steady, almost cold. "I taught you to take what you can hold. I'm only doing what you trained me to do." In that moment, Henry feels the room close in. Not with walls, but with meaning. On one side sits Thomas Becket, the voice of conscience, the ghost of a boundary Henry tried to erase. On the other stands Richard, the voice of blood, ambition, and inheritance, sharpened into steel. And Henry is trapped between them. He draws a breath. It rattles. He speaks anyway, as if he's forcing truth out of himself with the same stubborn will that once forced barons to kneel. "I built a kingdom from ashes," he says. His eyes drift toward the map again. "But not even law," he whispers, "can hold my own blood together." Thomas doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. Richard doesn't argue. He doesn't need to either. Outside, somewhere in the chapel tower, a bell begins to toll, slow, even, unhurried, like time itself. Henry's eyes close again, and the world begins to slide backward. The stone chamber of Chinon fades. The smell of smoke, wax, and old age dissolves into a different smell: wet earth, ash, and fear. A different dawn. England, years earlier, during the Civil War people later called the Anarchy. A country split open. Villages burned. Roads ruled by whoever had the sharper blade and the stronger horse. Smoke rising from broken rooftops. A small stone church standing stubbornly amid ruins, as if faith alone could hold the place together. A boy stands in the mud. Young Henry. He isn't wearing a crown. He isn't even sure if he'll live long enough to deserve one. He's just a child, staring at a tree near the gate of a battered town. A man hangs from it. No trial, no witnesses, no careful weighing of guilt. Just a rope, a body, and soldiers who needed to make a point. Beside Henry stands his mother, Matilda, hard-eyed, unbending, a woman who has watched men swear oaths and break them, watched castles change hands, watched justice become whatever the strongest man says it is. She grips her son's shoulder and makes him look, not to frighten him, to shape him. "Do you see?" she says. "This is England without law. This is what happens when the crown belongs to someone who can't hold it. If you ever sit on that throne, if you ever want this land to stop eating itself, then you must not rule by whim. You must build something stronger than men." Henry doesn't answer. He can't. His throat is tight. But something settles inside him, heavy and permanent. A vow he never speaks out loud. "If I live, if I win, if I wear the crown, then no soldier gets to decide life and death because he's bored. No lord gets to hang a man because he feels like it. There will be rules, there will be courts, there will be a spine to this kingdom." And the irony, the cruel, beautiful irony, is that he will keep that vow. He will build that spine. He will reshape England so thoroughly that even after his empire fractures, the system he created will keep walking forward, generation after generation. But he will never learn the one kind of surrender that laws cannot force. He will never learn how to loosen his grip inside his own house. The bell at Chinon echoes again, faint and distant, like a sound traveling through a long tunnel. And as the boy in the mud stares at the hanging body, the audience understands what Henry will only understand at the very end. The man who becomes obsessed with order doesn't do it because he loves power. He does it because he remembers what the world looks like without it. And once a man like that starts building, he doesn't know how to stop, until everything he built and everyone he loves finally becomes too heavy to hold.
England didn't make Henry II soft. It made him obsessed. Long before the crown, before the court, before the famous laws that would carry his name into the future, Henry was just a child standing in mud and smoke, watching the world fall apart. This was the Civil War people later called the Anarchy, and the name fits because nothing felt stable. Towns changed hands like dice rolls. Roads belonged to whoever had the sharpest blade that week. A hungry garrison could decide a village owed them food, then burn the houses afterward anyway. Even prayer didn't feel safe. One of Henry's earliest memories, one that would cling to him like a burr for the rest of his life, was a hanging near a gate. A man dragged forward, accused in the lazy way soldiers accuse people, because they can. There was no court, no careful questioning, no proof weighed against doubt, just a rope, a kick of a stool, and a body swaying in the cold air while bored men laughed as if it were entertainment. Henry stood there staring, and he didn't yet have the words for what he was seeing, but he understood the feeling, a world where life and death depended on someone else's mood. His mother, Matilda, steel wrapped in royal blood, didn't turn him away. She didn't cover his eyes. She made him look. "Remember this," her posture seemed to say, even if the exact words were different. "This is what England becomes when a crown is weak. This is what happens when there is no law strong enough to bind men." Henry didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight. But something settled inside him, heavy and permanent, a silent promise he never needed to speak out loud. "If I ever hold the crown, I will not let this happen again." And that promise wasn't romantic. It wasn't heroic in a storybook way. It was practical, even brutal. It meant rules that didn't bend because a lord was angry. It meant courts that didn't vanish because soldiers were bored. It meant a king who would rather be feared for his justice than loved for his mercy. The war dragged on, and childhood for Henry became a sequence of moves, from one fortress to another, from one ally to the next. He saw how quickly friendships turned into bargains, how oaths became paper-thin when the wind shifted, how people who spoke about God could still steal grain from starving families. When England became too dangerous, Henry was taken back across the Channel, and there, in Anjou, he met the other force that would shape him, his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet. Geoffrey wasn't a saint. He didn't raise Henry on fairy tales about honor. He raised him on reality. In Anjou's courtyards and great halls, Henry learned to ride, to fight, to endure. But Geoffrey's sharper lesson wasn't about swords. It was about people. "You don't win just by hitting harder," Geoffrey would say in his own rough way. "You win by knowing what the other man wants before he admits it to himself." So Henry watched. He watched faces at feasts. He watched hands during negotiations. He watched which men smiled too quickly and which men never smiled at all. He learned the difference between fear and loyalty, because they look similar from a distance, but they behave very differently when pressure arrives. He also learned something about power that would define his entire reign. Power isn't a single thing. It's a network, a set of relationships, a balance of favors and threats. A king who thinks power is only a crown is a king who will lose it. Eventually, the war in England reached that exhausted point where no one could truly win, only keep bleeding. Stephen, the king, was old. The realm was tired. Castles were costly, mercenaries were hungry, and even the nobles who benefited from disorder were starting to feel the bite. That's when Henry did something that would become his signature move. He chose the smarter victory instead of the bloodier one. He crossed to England as a young man, not yet crowned, not yet secure, leading a small force and a name that mattered. He wasn't coming as a reckless boy chasing glory. He was coming like a politician with armor. Both sides maneuvered, both sides threatened, and then, in a moment that could have ended in another slaughter, Henry offered a deal that sounded like compromise, but actually secured the future. Stephen would remain king until his death, and Henry would be recognized as the heir. It wasn't a dramatic victory. There was no famous battlefield where Henry won with a single charge, but it was something more rare in that century. It was a victory that saved lives and locked in legitimacy. In a land addicted to violence, Henry won by choosing restraint at exactly the moment restraint looked like weakness. When the agreement was made, you can imagine what Henry felt, though he would never say it out loud. Relief, yes, but also a new kind of fear. Because now the promise he made as a child wasn't distant anymore. It was coming toward him like a storm. If he was going to inherit a broken realm, then he would need to rebuild it in a way that made future civil wars harder, not just less likely, but harder. And that meant changing habits older than he was. It meant confronting barons who treated their lands like private kingdoms. It meant turning justice from a local weapon into a national system. And deep down, Henry already knew what that required. It required a king who never stopped moving, a king who worked like a man trying to outrun chaos. Even as he stood on the edge of that inheritance, Henry could look across England and see the scars, ruined villages, empty fields, terrified towns. He could hear the distrust in people's silences. He could feel how fragile the peace was, like thin ice over dark water. He also understood something most rulers learn too late. A crown does not automatically create authority. Authority has to be built, reinforced, repeated. It has to become routine, like a heartbeat. That's why Henry didn't just want a kingdom, he wanted a structure, a spine of law that would hold when men like Stephen, or men worse than Stephen, came along. And that is the real origin of Henry II. Not a prophecy, not a destiny written in the stars. A boy in the mud watching a man swing from a rope, realizing that if the world had no rules, then he would have to make them, because he couldn't bear to see England become that place again. And as the war-worn sun rose over a battered land, Henry's life narrowed into a single, relentless direction. The crown was coming, and with it, the work.
Aquitaine was a kingdom disguised as a duchy. Sunlit valleys, vineyards, stone cities humming with music, and beneath all that beauty, a kind of stubborn independence that made its lords feel less like nobles and more like rival princes. To rule Aquitaine, you didn't just need titles, you needed nerve, you needed speed, you needed someone who could make a decision and live with it. And that's why Eleanor of Aquitaine mattered. When Henry first heard her name, he didn't hear it like a romance. He heard it like a map being unfolded. Eleanor wasn't simply a woman with lands. She was a force, a ruler in her own right, experienced, feared, admired, and impossible to shrink into the role of a quiet consort. By the time Henry arrived in Poitiers, Eleanor had already done something that shocked Europe. She had slipped free of her marriage to Louis of France. Officially, it was an annulment, no male heir, too much distance between them, too many political and personal fractures to ignore. But everyone understood the real truth. Louis wanted a pious queen. Eleanor wanted a life large enough to fit her. And now she was free, which made her the most dangerous prize on the continent. Their first meeting didn't feel like courtly flirting. It felt like two predators measuring each other. Henry came in from the road, dusty, young, already carrying that restless energy like a weapon. Eleanor met him with a calm that wasn't softness, but control. She had seen kings up close, and she knew the difference between a crown and the man underneath it. They talked the way rulers talk when they're alone, half wit, half threat. Eleanor teased him with the rumors of Anjou's devil blood. Henry teased her with the reputation poets gave her, part Venus, part Medea. They smiled, but neither of them was smiling because they felt safe. Because what was forming between them wasn't just attraction, it was alliance. Eleanor knew what Henry could become, not just King of England, but master of a network of lands that could trap France between two jaws. Henry knew what Eleanor could give him, not only Aquitaine, but legitimacy in the south, and a partner who could hold her own against any lord who tried to test her. Their marriage was swift, practical, stunning. It was the sort of decision that made enemies before the wedding candles cooled. Louis of France didn't simply feel insulted, he felt cornered, because with one ceremony, Henry gained a duchy so vast it made France look smaller than it should have. And Henry, for all his obsession with law, understood something older than law. The world respects strength, and it fears momentum. This marriage gave him both. Soon after, Stephen died, and Henry crossed into England not as a claimant, but as a king. The coronation at Westminster wasn't just a holy ritual, it was a message to every baron who had built an illegal castle, every lord who learned to ignore authority during the Civil War. The age of convenient chaos was ending.
But there's a truth Henry learns quickly, and every ruler learns eventually. Crowns are not enough. A kingdom isn't governed by ceremony, it's governed by people, by officials, by courts. By men willing to do the dirty work of collecting money, enforcing justice, and making sure the king's word doesn't dissolve into rumor the moment it leaves the capital. Henry needed someone who could move between worlds, someone who understood parchment and power, negotiation and pressure, churchmen and merchants, someone sharp enough to see angles Henry didn't have time to stare at. That's when Thomas Becket answers the story. At first, Thomas isn't a saint. He isn't even a monk in the way people imagine monks. He's a clerk, young, clever, ambitious, working for Archbishop Theobald. He knows how to make the machinery of the church run smoothly, and more importantly, he knows how to translate the language of principle into the language of profit. When Henry first meets him, Thomas makes him laugh, not because he's a jester, but because he's fearless enough to talk to a king like a man. Henry likes that. He likes intelligence that doesn't bow too quickly. And Henry recognizes the deeper value. Thomas can be trusted to get things done. So Thomas rises, fast. He becomes Henry's chancellor, his right hand, the man who eats at the king's table, rides with him, hunts with him, sits with him late into the night over documents and strategy. Together, they start turning Henry's childhood vow into something real, a system of royal justice that reaches further than any baron's private court. In those years, the friendship between Henry and Thomas is real. It's not a rumor, it's not a performance. They are aligned in ambition, and they enjoy it. You can imagine them laughing after a long day, sharing wine, speaking in the quick, sharp shorthand that only close allies develop. And yet, even then, the fault line is already there. Henry doesn't just want cooperation from the church, he wants control. He wants one law strong enough to bind everyone, baron, peasant, and priest. Thomas, while he serves Henry, still belongs to another institution, another set of vows, another kind of authority. He doesn't fight Henry yet, but he understands, even if he doesn't admit it, that the king's vision is heading toward the very heart of church privilege. Henry doesn't see that as a problem, or maybe he sees it and tells himself he can solve it the way he solves everything, by choosing the right man and placing him in the right position. That's why when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, Henry sees opportunity. If Canterbury, the highest seat of the English church, belongs to someone loyal to Henry, then the church stops being a counterweight. It becomes a tool, a pillar under the crown instead of beside it. So Henry turns to Thomas and says, in effect, "I want you there." Thomas hesitates. He knows the danger, because once he wears that mitre, he won't just be Henry's friend, he will be the guardian of the church's independence, and the world will demand that he choose. Henry doesn't want to hear choose, he wants to hear obey. He believes Thomas can be both. That belief is not stupidity, it's the same confidence that built Henry's empire, the conviction that systems can be engineered, people can be placed, and outcomes can be shaped. But here, Henry is trying to engineer a human soul, and that is where kings, especially great kings, begin to fail. On the night before his consecration, Thomas prays alone. He isn't praying like a man certain of holiness, he's praying like a man who knows he is compromised, who has enjoyed power too much, who has lived too comfortably beside a king. He asks God for guidance, but beneath that, he's really asking for something else: strength. Because he senses the shape of what's coming. And Henry, at the same time, is already imagining a kingdom where the crown and the church move as one, where the chaos of Stephen's reign can never return, where law reaches everywhere. It's a beautiful vision. It's also the beginning of one of the greatest political tragedies in medieval history. Because from this point onward, every step Henry takes to bind the realm tighter will be met by a man he once trusted more than anyone. And every refusal Thomas gives will feel to Henry like betrayal. The partnership that built a kingdom is about to become the conflict that stains it forever.
Thomas Becket wasn't born to be a saint. If you'd met him at the beginning, you wouldn't have thought martyr. You would have thought operator. The kind of man who could walk into a room full of powerful people and somehow leave with all of them believing he was on their side. When Henry I noticed him, Thomas was still a young cleric in the service of Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury. Not a monk hidden away with prayer and silence, but a working man of the church, surrounded by scrolls, seals, accounts, and messengers. He lived in that world where power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a robe, sometimes it wears a ring of wax, and sometimes it's nothing more than a letter carried by the right writer at the right moment. Henry was building a kingdom, not just in the sense of castles and borders, but in the sense of a system, something that could hold England together after the nightmare of civil war. He needed loyal men, competent men, and above all, men who could get things done while the king was riding across half a continent. Thomas was exactly that. The first time Henry spoke to him, the story goes that Thomas made the king laugh. Not because he told jokes, but because he was quick and fearless. He wasn't the kind of cleric who trembled before royal anger. He could match Henry's pace in conversation, fast, sharp, practical. Henry loved that. He was a man who never stopped moving, never stopped working, never stopped thinking. And he liked being surrounded by people who could keep up. If Henry was a blade, Thomas was the whetstone, smooth, precise, always sharpening. So Henry pulled him close. He made Thomas his chancellor. From that moment, the king and the cleric moved like a pair. They shared meals, they rode the same roads, they sat at the same tables late into the night while candles burned down and the fire turned to embers. The world saw a king and his minister, but the people closest to them saw something more dangerous, a friendship that looked almost like a second crown. Thomas didn't serve Henry from a distance. He was at his shoulder in the thick of things. When Henry needed money, Thomas found it. When Henry needed a message delivered quickly and convincingly, Thomas wrote it in a way that made refusal feel impossible. When Henry needed a compromise that still felt like a victory, Thomas negotiated it. And Thomas understood something Henry understood too. England was still scarred. The law was still uneven. Justice still depended too often on who you were and which lord you served. Henry wanted to change that. He wanted royal courts that mattered. He wanted sheriffs who answered to the crown. He wanted people to stop living at the mercy of a baron's mood. And for a while, Thomas wanted the same thing. You can picture them together, out on the road, rain on their cloaks, mud on their boots, talking not like king and servant, but like two men planning how to tame a country. Henry would talk about order the way other men talk about glory. Thomas would talk about the machinery needed to make that order real. Records, revenues, writs, men in the right places. They hunted together too, because kings hunt, and because hunting is where you learn the truth about people. You see who panics, who hesitates, who rushes ahead for credit, and who stays steady. Henry watched, Thomas watched, and somewhere along the way, Henry began to trust Thomas almost more than he trusted his own blood. That trust is what makes the next part so painful. Because there was always a problem hiding inside the friendship, a fault line that neither man wanted to stare at for too long. Henry's vision was simple, in the way dangerous visions often are. One kingdom, one law, one authority that ultimately led back to the crown. He didn't hate the church. He didn't want to burn monasteries or mock God. He was a medieval king. He took religion seriously. But he had grown up watching chaos, and he had promised himself that chaos would never rule England again. So when Henry looked at the church, he didn't just see holiness, he also saw exemption, privilege, a separate legal world, courts that could shield guilty men because they wore a collar and spoke Latin. Henry couldn't stand that. To Henry, law wasn't simply a tool, it was the spine that held the realm upright. And a spine can't be made of two different bones pulling in different directions. Thomas, as chancellor, could help Henry push the church. He could pressure abbots, negotiate with bishops, squeeze revenues, and make the king's will feel inevitable.
But even then, before anyone called him saint, Thomas still belonged to the church. He knew its pride, he knew its fears, he knew what would happen if the king pushed too far. At times he warned Henry, quietly, carefully, and Henry, as always, listened only as far as it was convenient. Because Henry didn't just want cooperation from the church, he wanted control over the boundary itself. He wanted to decide where the king's law ended and the church's law began. That's a temptation that comes with power. When you've bent barons to your will, when you've brought castles down and raised courts up, you start believing there isn't a wall you can't walk through. Then came the moment that changed everything. One night, after arguments, after letters, after the daily weight of ruling, Henry slept and his mind did what it had learned to do all his life. It turned fear into images. In the dream, he stood in a wasteland that felt like England during the Civil War. Empty, cold, stripped of order. In one direction was a tree with bodies swinging from branches, death without judgment, violence without law. In the other direction was a different tree, its branches heavy with sealed parchments, law made physical, like fruit you could harvest. And between those two trees stood Thomas, not smiling, not speaking, just there. A question shaped itself in Henry's head, even in sleep. Which side are you on? And Thomas Dream, or Conscience Thomas, didn't answer. He only lifted his face toward the sky, as if listening for a bell far away. Henry awoke with sweat on his skin and a tightness in his chest. He didn't tell anyone, not his guards, not his wife, not even Thomas. But the dream mattered, because it revealed something Henry didn't want to admit. Deep down, he already knew this friendship had an end. He just didn't know what kind of end. In the days after, Henry worked harder. If anxiety rose in him, he drowned it in motion. He wrote, he judged, he planned, he signed, he argued. He did what he had always done. He tried to build order faster than chaos could rise. And Thomas stayed at his side, capable and loyal in the practical sense, still laughing with Henry at times, still moving the machinery of government like a master craftsman. But the seed had been planted. Because what Henry wanted was not only a minister, he wanted certainty. He wanted a man who would always choose the king's side, even if it meant breaking something sacred. And what Thomas was becoming, slowly, almost invisibly, was a man who might one day refuse. Not out of hatred, out of duty. The irony is brutal. Henry chose Thomas because he was the smartest man in the room, the most efficient, the most useful, the most fearless. And those same qualities, intelligence, discipline, and fearlessness, were exactly what would later make Thomas dangerous to him. For now, the two men still rode together under the same banners, still spoke in the shorthand of allies. England's wheels of justice turned faster, the king's authority spread, the kingdom felt more solid with every year. But beneath the surface, the question remained, unspoken and unresolved, like a blade left on a table between friends. When the crown and the church finally collide, what will Thomas Becket be? Henry's man or God's?
When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry II didn't just see a vacancy in the church, he saw a lever. Canterbury wasn't an ordinary bishop's seat, it was the highest spiritual office in England, the one voice powerful enough to challenge a king and be heard. For Henry, who had spent his life trying to bind England into a single, disciplined system, that seat looked like the last loose knot in the rope. So he made a choice that, on paper, looked brilliant. He turned to Thomas Becket. Thomas had been his chancellor, his closest minister, and, more than that, his companion. They had eaten together, hunted together, traveled together, argued and laughed like men who trusted each other. Thomas knew Henry's mind. He knew how Henry wanted the realm to work, and Henry believed he knew Thomas. Henry called him in, away from the noise of court, away from the eyes of nobles and bishops,
In a private room, lit by candles and a low fire, with documents and seals spread across the table, Henry didn't circle the subject. He did what he always did when he wanted something. He went straight at it. "I want you in Canterbury." For a moment, Thomas didn't respond the way Henry expected. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, he didn't treat it like a promotion. He hesitated. He understood what Henry was really asking for. Not a holy man, not a shepherd of souls. Henry wanted a man of the crown sitting in the church's highest chair, a loyal friend who would smooth every conflict, sign every paper, and make the word exemption disappear from the English vocabulary. Thomas tried, carefully, to warn him. He said, in effect, that this was not wise, that the church would not accept him as a true archbishop if he remained the king's intimate ally, that he could not serve two masters in the way Henry imagined. But Henry never built his power by listening to warnings. Henry believed in solutions, in systems, in placing the right man into the right position and watching the machine run. He believed Thomas could be both. And Thomas, for all his intelligence, for all his caution, was still a man living inside Henry's gravitational pull. He had risen because Henry lifted him. He had tasted power because Henry offered it. It is hard, almost impossible, to refuse a king who believes he is doing you honor. So Thomas accepted. In the days that followed, the court reacted the way courts always react. Some were pleased, some were disturbed, many were confused. Men who had watched Thomas drink and laugh beside the king now tried to imagine him as the guardian of England's souls. But Thomas was no fool. He knew that once he wore the archbishop's vestments, every eye would change. Every word he spoke would be measured against a standard Henry could not control. The night before his consecration, Thomas went alone into a chapel. It was quiet, stone, candlelight, and the smell of wax and incense. No politics, no documents, no writers waiting with messages, just the altar and the weight of what he was about to become. He knelt and prayed, not like a man already holy, but like a man who knew his own flaws too well. Thomas had enjoyed the world. He had enjoyed fine horses and fine food, and the thrill of influence. He wasn't pretending otherwise, and that, in a strange way, made his prayer more dangerous. Because it wasn't the prayer of a hypocrite, it was the prayer of a man asking for strength to become something he had not been. And then, the next day, in the cathedral, before bishops and nobles and incense-thick air, Thomas Becket was consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry watched it all with satisfaction. He believed he had secured the last piece of the realm. He believed he had placed his strongest ally at the head of the only institution that could resist him. And if you'd asked Henry in that moment, he would have told you he was protecting England, protecting it from the return of chaos, from barons acting like kings, from a country held hostage by private grudges. But what Henry didn't understand, what he could not understand, is that the mitre does not sit lightly on a man's head. It changes the way he hears the world. And almost immediately, Henry saw the change. It began with something that should have been simple. A priest committed a serious crime, one of those cases that made ordinary people furious. A man of God, wearing the collar of the church, had done something that any layman would have been dragged to a royal court for. Henry's reaction was instinctive. Bring him to my court. Let him be judged by the king's law. This wasn't personal. It wasn't spite. In Henry's mind, it was the very point of everything he had been building. A kingdom where the law didn't bend around privilege, where justice didn't depend on whether you belonged to an institution powerful enough to protect you. Henry looked at Thomas, his friend, his former minister, and expected agreement. After all, wasn't that why Thomas was there? Thomas said no. Not with a shout, not with a dramatic gesture. He didn't need that. The authority of the church wasn't loud. It was cold. It was ancient. It was built into stone walls and rituals and the belief of 1,000 years. Thomas's refusal landed like a hammer. He said, in essence, that the church would handle its own, that a cleric belonged to ecclesiastical justice, that the king's court did not rule inside the sanctuary of the church's privilege. Henry stared at him as if he didn't recognize him, because this wasn't just a disagreement about one criminal priest, it was a boundary dispute over the border between crown and church, and Henry had never tolerated borders inside his own kingdom. In private, the argument sharpened. Henry reminded Thomas of the anarchy, of what England looked like when authority was fractured, of what happened when men could pick and choose which law applied to them. He said, in effect, "I'm not asking for power for pleasure, I'm asking for the only thing that keeps this realm from tearing itself apart again." Thomas answered with something Henry could barely hear without feeling insulted, that there was a law above the king's law, that the church was not a department of the crown, that if the king could drag priests into royal courts today, he could drag bishops tomorrow, and one day he could drag the church itself into chains. In that moment, Henry understood the true nature of the problem. It wasn't that Thomas had become his enemy out of hatred, it was that Thomas had become his enemy out of duty. Henry had assumed friendship would win. Thomas had discovered that his new office demanded resistance. And suddenly, everything Henry had built, every expectation, every plan, every sense of control, hit a wall that did not move just because Henry wanted it to. That wall was not stone. It was belief. It was the idea that a king could not be allowed to hold everything. Not the courts, not the church, not the final word over every soul in the realm. Henry's anger flared because this felt like betrayal. He had lifted Thomas higher than any man in England outside the royal family. He had trusted him. He had placed him where kings placed only their most reliable allies, and Thomas repaid him by saying no in the place where it mattered most. If you stand back and look at it, the tragedy is almost perfect. Henry chose Thomas because he was brilliant, disciplined, fearless, everything a king could want in a minister, and those exact qualities, once placed inside a mitre, turned Thomas into the only man in England capable of defying Henry without blinking. From that day forward, the friendship between king and archbishop never truly recovered. It might still have moments of negotiation, moments of attempted peace, even moments that looked from a distance like reconciliation, but the foundation was cracked. Because now, both men understood something they could no longer ignore. There were two laws in England, and they were about to fight for the right to be the only one that mattered.
For a while, England balanced on a knife edge, and somehow it didn't fall. After Thomas Becket became Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry II kept trying to do what he always did: turn conflict into process, turn resistance into compliance, turn messy human problems into a system he could manage. He had done it with barons, he had done it with sheriffs, he had done it with castles and courts. So he assumed he could do it with the church. But the church wasn't just another institution. It was a second center of gravity, a rival authority that didn't need soldiers or siege engines to win. It had time. It had ritual. It had belief. And in medieval England, belief could move crowds faster than any royal messenger. At first, the clash felt technical, almost boring on the surface. Henry wanted priests who committed serious crimes to face the king's justice. He wanted one law for the whole realm, no exceptions, no special courts that could soften punishments just because a man wore a collar. Thomas refused. Not loudly, not theatrically, but firmly and repeatedly. Every refusal drew a darker line in the sand. There was royal law, and there was church law, and Canterbury would not let the crown swallow it. Henry answered the way he always answered opposition. He pushed harder. He called councils, he gathered bishops and nobles, he produced documents, customs, clauses, reasonable reforms that sounded like common sense if you heard them from a king trying to keep order. Later, people would attach the name Clarendon to this phase of the struggle. What mattered wasn't the paper itself, what mattered was the message behind it. Henry was saying,
England cannot survive with two legal worlds. The realm needs one spine. Thomas was saying the king cannot be allowed to own every spine in the body. And once that's the argument, you're not really debating procedure anymore. You're debating the shape of power itself. In those years, you can almost feel the pressure building. It shows up in little moments. Bishops who stop smiling when the king walks in. Courtiers who whisper in corridors. Monks who suddenly preach sermons that sound suspiciously like politics. And Henry, never patient, never still, growing sharper with every delay. Then the break came. Becket found himself cornered. He signed things and then recoiled from them. He tried to negotiate without surrendering. He tried to serve both God and his king, and discovered that both sides demanded exclusivity. And eventually, he fled. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry's former best friend, crossed the Channel and placed himself under the protection of the French king. In exile, Thomas became something Henry had never planned for, a symbol. Because a man in exile is a story people can use, a story the church could tell from pulpits, a story that foreign courts could use as leverage, a story that Henry's reforms into something they were never meant to be, at least in Henry's mind, tyranny. Meanwhile, Henry kept governing, he kept writing, he kept building his legal machine. He punished and rewarded, replaced officials, issued writs, strengthened the royal courts. England in many ways ran. The system worked. But the conflict didn't go away. It just changed shape. Henry and Thomas exchanged letters like arrows. Each side appealed upward, to bishops, to Rome, to public opinion. And in the background, France watched with interest, because France always watched with interest when the Angevin world began to crack. In exile, Thomas changed too. He was no longer the chancellor in fine clothes, laughing at the king's table. He was the archbishop stripped down to essentials, living among monks, praying more, speaking as if every word might be weighed at Judgment Day. And that made him even harder to control. At some point, both men attempted what looked like reconciliation. They met on the continent, two old allies standing face to face again, years older, and now guarded. Henry wanted the same thing he had always wanted: order, stability, a kingdom that wouldn't slide back into civil war the moment the crown weakened. Thomas wanted something Henry could not offer without limiting himself, a boundary the crown would not cross. They spoke carefully. Henry offered concessions with the precision of a man negotiating a treaty. Thomas accepted some things, refused others, and for a moment, it looked like the storm might pass. Then Thomas returned to England, and England received him like a hero. That, more than any parchment or legal clause, alarmed Henry. Because rulers understand crowds. They understand when love becomes dangerous. Thomas had become more than an archbishop. He had become a rallying point. People were already calling him holy, already telling stories about his courage, already framing the entire conflict as a simple moral fable. A righteous churchman standing against a king who wanted too much. And Henry, who had spent his life trying to prevent chaos, could feel something close to chaos rising again, this time in the form of public opinion. The final spark came in Normandy. Henry was in his hall, surrounded by nobles and household knights, hearing reports that Thomas was still defying him, still issuing punishments, still wielding spiritual authority against the king's allies. Whether Henry's allies deserved it or not didn't matter. What mattered was that Henry saw it as a direct challenge, and he was exhausted, sickened by years of strain, furious at being cornered by a man he once trusted. In a moment of raw anger, one of those moments that last seconds but reshape centuries, Henry exploded. He didn't issue a formal order. He didn't call for an execution. He did something more dangerous. He spoke like a king who forgot that kings are always being listened to. And in the shadows of the hall, 4 king's knights heard him, not as a complaint, not as a grief-stricken outburst, but as a permission. They looked at each other. They didn't need a written command. They didn't need a signed seal. In their world, a king's fury was a signal, a direction of travel. That night, they saddled horses in the rain. They rode hard. They crossed land and water with one purpose tightening in their minds with every mile. And England didn't know yet. Canterbury still stood, cold stone and candlelight, the cathedral breathing incense into the winter air. Priests still moved through the aisles, bells still rang. Thomas still spoke calmly in sacred spaces, believing, perhaps, that whatever came next would be judged by God more than by men. But the sound of hooves was already on its way. Not the hooves of a messenger, not the hooves of a friend, the hooves of men who believed they were about to do their king a service inside the holiest building in England. And when those men reached the cathedral doors, the struggle between two laws would stop being an argument. It would become blood on stone.
Night in Normandy felt heavier than usual, like the air itself knew something terrible had been said. The torches in the great hall hissed and smoked, throwing restless shadows over stone walls and wet cloaks. Outside, rain worked steadily at the shutters. Inside, Henry II stood in the middle of his own power and looked, for a moment, like a man trapped inside it. He had listened to report after report, more defiance from Canterbury, more spiritual punishments aimed at men Henry relied on, more proof that Thomas Becket, once his chancellor, once his closest friend, was not bending. Henry's patience had been stretched thin for years, the kind of thin that doesn't snap loudly at first, it just frays, it wears. It makes a man sharper and faster and more certain that if he doesn't force the world back into order, the world will fall apart again. And then, Henry did the one thing a king can never safely do. He spoke like an ordinary man. Not as a formal command, not as a written order, not with wax seals and witnesses and careful wording, just a burst of anger, an exhausted, furious human outcry in the middle of a smoky hall. The problem was simple. Kings are never ordinary men. Every word a king says has weight, whether he intends it or not. And in the shadows near the pillars, 4 knights heard Henry's anger the way soldiers are trained to hear it, not as emotion, but as direction. They didn't ask for clarification. They didn't seek permission in writing. They didn't wait for morning. They looked at each other, made a decision in silence, and walked out into the rain. In the stable yard, the lanterns swung and sputtered. Horses steamed in the cold, wet air. Leather straps were pulled tight with hard, practiced hands. Buckles clicked. Hooves splashed in mud. The knights mounted and rode, the sound of iron and rain and urgency following them into the night. They crossed land with the grim rhythm of men who believe they are doing a duty. Then they crossed water, cold, rough, wind-driven, until England rose again on the horizon. And all the while, Canterbury went on as if nothing was coming. The city streets darkened with winter dusk. Torches were lit, doors were barred. In the cathedral precinct, the great stone building stood like a fortress of faith. Columns, arches, and candlelight. Incense drifted, softening edges, making every breath feel heavier, older, closer to God. Thomas Becket was there. He had come back from exile to a welcome that felt like a procession. People pressed close to see him. They knelt as he passed. They spoke his name with a kind of reverence Henry could not control. Thomas moved through it all with the calm of a man who had already decided what mattered most. He wasn't trying to start a war, but he was no longer willing to live by the king's rules when the king's rules crossed into the church's ground. That night, commotion reached the cathedral like a cold draft. Armored men, voices sharper than prayer, boots on stone. Clergy recoiled. Some tried to pull Thomas away, toward safer rooms, toward doors that could be barred. But Thomas stepped forward instead. Not dramatically, not like a man performing heroism, like a man who knows that running would only turn the cathedral into a hunting ground.
like a man who understands that in the story about to be written, the location matters. The knights confronted him, there in the sacred space, under candles and stone. They demanded he submit, that he come with them, that he bend. Thomas refused. And then, the argument ended the way arguments often ended in the 12th century, when men with swords decided the debate was over. Steel left scabbards, torchlight flashed along blade edges, the air filled with shocked movement, robes swaying, bodies backing away, candles trembling in a sudden draft. Thomas stood unarmed near the altar steps. He did not beg, he did not bargain, he did not try to save himself with clever words, because this was no longer a matter of cleverness. The first strike staggered him. A second drove him down. His mitre fell. Blood hit stone. And then it was done. In the aftermath, the cathedral felt impossibly large and impossibly quiet. Candle flames kept burning, indifferent. Incense kept drifting, indifferent. The stone did not change. Only the living did. The knights stepped back, breathing hard, their swords lowering. Clergy stared as if they had witnessed the world crack. Outside, the city began to stir. A bell started to ring, not the clean, celebratory peal of a feast day, but a hard, urgent toll. People ran toward the precinct with fear in their faces and questions in their throats. And then, the news broke free of Canterbury and began to spread across Europe the way fire spreads through dry straw. A messenger rode out at dawn. Mud flew from hooves. Breath steamed in the cold air. The cathedral tower shrank behind him as he carried the story into the wider world. When the message reached Henry, it didn't land like triumph. It landed like a blow. Henry was not a fool. He understood instantly what had happened, and he understood instantly what it would mean. He had not written an order for murder, but he had spoken in a way that made murder feel like service to the crown. In the room where he heard the news, the king who had always moved faster than everyone else suddenly looked still, smaller, as if his own words had caught him and pinned him to the wall. What do you do as a king when the world believes you killed a saint? Because that is what happened next. Not slowly, not over decades, almost immediately. Thomas Becket became more than a dead man. He became a symbol. The church framed him as a martyr, an archbishop who died defending the rights of God against the hunger of a king. Pilgrims began to arrive. They walked muddy roads with staves and crosses, driven by grief, devotion, and the hunger for meaning. In Canterbury, candles multiplied, offerings accumulated, stories began, stories of healing, of answered prayers, of miracles whispered from mouth to mouth. Whether the miracles were real mattered less than the fact that people believed them, and belief was power. Henry's position became impossible. If he resisted, he risked being cast as a tyrant fighting holiness itself. If he ignored it, he risked losing control of the realm. A king could survive a military defeat, a king could survive an insult, but a king could not easily survive the belief that heaven was against him. So Henry did what kings hate doing. He submitted. Not by handing over lands, not by surrendering a castle, but by surrendering his pride in public. He came to Canterbury. He came without ceremony. He came like a penitent. He walked barefoot on cold stones. He entered the cathedral that had been stained by the deed carried out in his name. He knelt at Thomas's tomb, head lowered, hands on stone, before monks and clergy who watched in silence. Then, in a ritual both political and spiritual, Henry allowed himself to be disciplined. One by one, monks struck his bare back with thin rods, controlled blows, not to kill, but to shame, to punish, to cleanse. Henry flinched like any human being would. He stayed kneeling anyway. It wasn't only repentance, it was strategy. He needed the church to see him as a sinner seeking mercy, not as a king daring heaven to strike him down. He needed England to see that even the king could be humbled, so that the kingdom would not tear itself apart again. Afterward, Henry rose from Canterbury alive, but changed. The system he had built still functioned. Royal courts still sat, sheriffs still collected revenues, messages still moved along the roads. England did not collapse, but Henry's authority was marked by blood in a way it never truly recovered from. And Thomas continued to grow in power after death. Candles burned at his shrine day and night. The cathedral became a magnet. The story became larger than the man, larger than the king. In the end, the tragedy is almost perfect in its cruelty. Henry II spent his life trying to build one law, one order, one kingdom that could never fall back into the chaos of his childhood. And Thomas, his friend, his creation, his mistake, became the boundary Henry could never erase. Not in life, and not, finally, even in death.
The strangest thing about Henry II's court is how often it looks calm, right up until you notice what people aren't saying. From the outside, it's all stone halls and banners, torchlight on polished wood, a kingdom finally running like a machine. Guards change watch, clerks copy writs, horses are saddled for the next journey. On paper, it's order. But inside the king's own household, something has started to warp. You can feel it at dinner. The high table is bright with candles, the cups are full, the nobles laugh at the right moments. And yet, Henry and Eleanor sit beside each other like two rulers sharing a border, civil on the surface, armed underneath. Their sons watch them the way young men watch a storm line on the horizon, trying to guess whether it's going to pass or break directly over their heads. Richard, even as a teenager, already has that look. Eyes that don't drift, posture that doesn't soften. He's not just listening to words, he's measuring power. Because Henry's greatest strength as a king is also the seed of his greatest disaster as a father. He cannot let go. Henry has built a kingdom by holding every strand of it in his hand. If something wobbles, he tightens his grip. If a baron resists, he rides out. If a court fails, he reforms it. That approach works on castles and officials. It does not work on sons who are growing into men. So Henry tries something that looks at first like a generous solution. He decides to crown his eldest son, Henry the young king, while he himself is still alive. It's a public message to the realm. The dynasty is secure. No more chaos, no more uncertainty. The crown will pass smoothly. The ceremony is magnificent. Westminster's packed. Incense hangs in the air. The boy, still young, still hungry for recognition, walks the aisle while the kingdom watches. A crown is placed on his head. People cheer. And for one shining moment, it looks like Henry has outplayed fate itself. But here's the trap. Henry gives his son the symbol and keeps the substance. The young king wears a crown and sits in councils, but the real decisions still flow to Henry II. The real authority still belongs to the father. Advisors still speak to Henry, not the crowned son beside him. Money, appointments, justice, those levers remain in the king's hands. To Henry II, this makes perfect sense. You don't hand a loaded kingdom to an untested young man just because he wants to feel important. Henry remembers civil war too well. He remembers what happens when power's weak. To the young king, it feels like humiliation. A crown that doesn't come with power isn't a gift. It's a reminder. A bright metal circle that says, "You are next," while your father quietly says, "Not yet." And the longer "not yet" lasts, the more it poisons everything. Eleanor sees it clearly. So does Richard. So does Geoffrey. Even John, the youngest, still close enough to Henry to be treated like a favorite, absorbs the lesson.
Love in this family is tangled up with land, titles, and control. Meanwhile, away from the ceremonies of England, Richard is becoming something else entirely. Aquitaine does not raise soft men. It raises lords who either dominate or die. Richard trains under a hard sun. He rides, fights, disciplines his vassals. He learns siegecraft and close combat. He learns how to break a rebellion quickly, because in Aquitaine, if you hesitate, the next rebellion is already forming. In one courtyard, troubadours play soft music under arches, beautiful, almost unreal, while soldiers walk past with dusty boots and bandaged arms. That contrast becomes Richard's world. Poetry in one hand, a sword in the other. And the more Richard wins, the more he feels he has earned something his father still refuses to grant: trust. Back in Henry's orbit, the pressure keeps building. Henry tries to bind the dynasty together like he binds the realm, through planning, marriage alliances, land allocations, careful arrangements. But the problem is that his sons don't want arrangements. They want agency. They want territory that is truly theirs. They want the right to make decisions and be held accountable for them, like real rulers, not royal ornaments. And at the same time, Henry's private life pours oil on every flame. In a secluded manor garden, lanterns glowing in the summer dusk, Henry walks with Rosamund Clifford. It's quiet, almost peaceful. Too peaceful for a man who rules by motion. You don't even need words to understand what this is. A secret he believes he can keep. A comfort he believes he deserves. But secrets in medieval courts don't stay secrets. They travel faster than horses. When Eleanor hears, something in her expression changes. Not into hysterics. Eleanor isn't built that way. It becomes colder, sharper. The anger of someone who has been treated like a political partner when convenient and like a possession when inconvenient. When Henry and Eleanor finally confront each other, it isn't a melodramatic scene of shouting and tears. It's worse than that. It's controlled. Eleanor speaks like a ruler, not a wounded spouse. Henry answers like a king, not a husband. They don't just argue about loyalty or love, they argue about the structure of the entire dynasty, about whether the sons will ever be allowed to rule as men, or whether Henry will keep them in suspension forever. Eleanor warns him, in essence, if you don't give them a future they can live inside, they'll build a future without you. Henry hears the warning and still cannot loosen his grip. And then the warning becomes reality. Across the channel, in the French court, Louis VII sees opportunity, because foreign kings always see opportunity when a powerful family begins to split. The young king, Richard and Geoffrey, gather under French eyes. Letters are drafted, seals are pressed into hot wax, promises are made, men who have grievances decide they now have a banner worth fighting under. Soon, rebel standards rise over castles in England and Normandy. Men begin to choose sides, and Eleanor makes her own choice. She attempts to leave, moving at dawn under a traveling cloak, pushing towards her sons and towards rebellion. It's a bold move, one that proves she's not a passive figure in this story. She's a player. But Henry's network is faster than her courage. On a road at the edge of a forest, loyal men block her path. Horses brake hard. Cloaks snap in the cold air. Eleanor sits under her hood, eyes blazing. And when she realizes she's been caught, she does not plead. She accepts capture like a queen who refuses to give her enemies the satisfaction of watching her break. From that moment, Henry makes a decision that will stain their marriage forever. He imprisons Eleanor, not for days, not for weeks, for years. Meanwhile, the rebellion spreads. Sieges, skirmishes, burned manors, panicked villages. The very chaos Henry has spent his life trying to prevent begins to reappear, wearing the faces of his own children. Henry responds with what he knows: speed, pressure, relentless campaigning. He lays siege to fortresses. He rides between fronts. He uses discipline and money and the machinery of power he built. He wins, because Henry II is very hard to defeat when he's fully awake and fully committed. Castles fall, rebel forces retreat, the uprising is crushed. But the victory is hollow, because the enemy wasn't just rebels, it was his family. After the fighting, Henry returns to halls where banners hang and torches burn low. He looks at maps where markers show territories held and recovered. He moves pieces back into place, England, Normandy, Aquitaine, trying to restore order. And then he pauses, fingers hovering, because he realizes something that no law can fix. You can move tokens on a map, but you can't move the human hearts those tokens represent. Richard is still out there, stronger than ever, less patient than before. The young king is humiliated and hungry. Geoffrey is watching and learning. John is close, but even closeness in this house comes with conditions. And Eleanor sits behind stone walls, unbroken. By the time Henry stands alone at night in a map room, candlelit flickering over borders and seals, he can finally see the shape of the truth he's been avoiding. He built a system that can govern a kingdom, but he cannot govern the people he loves the same way. And from here on, every time Henry tightens his grip to keep the empire from splitting, the splitting inside his family only gets worse.
By the early 1180s, Henry II had already won the kind of victories most kings only dream about. He had built a realm that stretched across seas and languages. He had built courts that traveled, records that lasted, and a royal authority that didn't vanish the moment his horse left town. And yet, the older he got, the more it became clear. The battles that mattered most weren't on the frontier. They were in his own house. It began, strangely enough, with celebration. A tournament field in northern France, bright banners, polished lances, crowds hungry for spectacle. The young king, Henry's eldest son, loved this world. He had been crowned already, crowned while his father lived, but he still lived like a man trying to prove that the crown meant something. He chased applause the way other men chased land. From the outside, he looked like everything a prince should be, handsome, generous, surrounded by knights. But inside his pavilion, between bouts, the air felt different. His laughter came too sharp. His face paled too quickly. A cough lingered longer than it should. Then the body finally demanded its price. What began as fatigue turned to fever. What was dismissed as a passing sickness became something that wouldn't let go. The tournament noise faded, replaced by the quiet horror of a sick room. Shuttered windows, candles burning in daylight, physicians whispering and avoiding the king's eyes. A messenger rode hard to find Henry, and Henry, who had crossed entire kingdoms to crush rebellions, rode now for something he could not command with soldiers. He arrived in the south to find his crowned son reduced to a weak figure on linen sheets, skin damp, eyes glassy, voice thin. There's a particular kind of pain in watching your child become small. Henry stood at the bedside and reached out like a man who didn't know where to place his hands. For years he had held power with certainty, but here he could only hold his son's fingers, faint pressure, a weak squeeze, then nothing. The young king whispered, and you can imagine what that sounded like. Not the proud crown-wearer, but the frightened child beneath the ceremony. He had wanted so badly to be someone, not just a symbol. He had wanted the substance of kingship, not only the shine. Henry listened without interruption, because there was no point in argument anymore. There were no treaties to negotiate, no castles to take, no system strong enough to stop a human body from failing. And then the young king was gone. Afterwards, the bells rang, slow and heavy. A procession formed, a bier moved through torchlight, monks murmured prayers, nobles lowered their eyes. Henry watched it all like a man standing outside his own life. He didn't break down in public. Henry rarely did. But something changed anyway. Not in his policy. He was still Henry, still relentless, but in the way the future felt.
It was no longer a distant concept he could plan around. It was suddenly fragile, unreliable, capable of snapping. The family tree that was supposed to secure the dynasty had just lost its tallest branch. And the cruel rhythm continued. A few years later, Geoffrey, another son, another piece on Henry's dynastic board, was killed in a tournament accident in Paris. The details didn't matter as much as the pattern. Horses, crowds, a moment of chaos, and then the final stillness. To a medieval audience, this wasn't just tragedy, it was a warning. People believed God spoke through outcomes, and these outcomes were speaking loudly. Henry received the news in candlelight, holding a parchment that suddenly felt heavier than armor. He set it down carefully, as if paper could shatter. And in the quiet after, you can see him, older now, shoulders tight, staring at a map of lands he still controlled, while the sons who were meant to inherit them disappeared one by one. Meanwhile, the son who stayed strongest was the one Henry struggled with most, Richard. In Aquitaine, Richard had become exactly what that land demanded: decisive, ruthless when necessary, brilliant in war. He could listen to troubadours in the courtyard and then ride out to break a rebellion before sundown. He had the glamour of a warrior and the cold focus of a commander. Henry should have been proud. On some level, he was. But pride isn't the same as trust. Henry kept tightening his grip on the dynasty, the way he tightened his grip on the realm. He kept delaying, managing, resisting the idea of handing real authority to a son who was already a man. And Richard felt that delay like a chain. He had fought, he had bled, he had held Aquitaine together, yet his father still treated him like a tool to be repositioned, not a ruler to be recognized. Then a new figure rose in France, Philip II, young, patient, and dangerously clear-eyed. Philip didn't need to beat Henry in a heroic battle. He understood that Henry's empire was not one block of stone. It was a structure held together by personal loyalty, family unity, and constant motion. If you could interrupt those things, the structure would crack. So Philip did what great political predators do. He fed the fracture. He offered Richard what Richard wanted most: recognition, respect, a future not filtered through Henry's control. And he did it in rooms lit by candles, over maps, with voices kept low. No drama, no shouting, just calm strategy. Richard didn't fall for it because he was naive. He fell for it because it solved a problem he had been living with for years: a father who would not let go. Henry heard rumors, then confirmations. Letters arrived. Faces at court went cautious. The atmosphere changed, the way it always does when a king sends his betrayal. His eyes sharpened, his temper shortened. His body, already under strain, began to fail him more often. There were nights when pain doubled him over, and he waved physicians away like he could command his own flesh into obedience. There were mornings when he rode anyway, because stopping felt like surrender. And there were moments, private, terrifying moments, when his mind began to haunt him. In one of those half-sleep states, Henry saw a chapel doorway, candlelight, stone arches, and shadowy figures, sons he had lost, sons he had fought, sons he could no longer control. They didn't speak, they didn't accuse, they didn't need to. The silence itself was a judgment. Henry woke drenched in sweat, breath uneven, and stared into darkness like a man realizing that even the greatest builder cannot build his way out of death. Still, he kept moving. He kept issuing orders. He kept riding between castles and councils. He kept trying to force Philip into the one kind of contest Henry respected, a decisive battle. But Philip wouldn't give it to him. That was Philip's genius. He refused Henry the clean, heroic moment. He chose slow pressure instead: bribery, alliances, controlled withdrawals, carefully timed attacks. War not as spectacle, but as erosion. And Richard stood at Philip's side, another kind of tragedy, not because Richard was weak, but because he was strong enough to make his choice matter. By now, Henry could feel it. The empire was still standing, but it was standing on older legs, legs that ached, legs that stumbled, and behind him, the myth of Becket still glowed in candlelight at Canterbury, reminding the world that Henry's reign, for all its order, was stained with blood on stone. In the end, Part 9 of Henry's story isn't about a single battle or a single law. It's about a king watching the future slip away in pieces, first through death, then through betrayal, and realizing too late that the tightest grip in the world can't hold what refuses to be held. Because the final enemy Henry faces isn't France, it isn't a rebellious baron, it isn't even the church, it's time. And time is the one opponent no king ever defeats.
Richard was the sharpest blade Henry II ever forged. He'd grown up in Aquitaine, a land that didn't reward softness. In those southern valleys where troubadours could sing under stone arches in the morning and a castle could be burning by nightfall, Richard learned two languages, poetry and war, and he became fluent in both. By the time he was a young man, Richard wasn't just Henry's son. He was the Duke of Aquitaine in the only way that mattered, by force of personality, by speed, by discipline, by the kind of hard competence that makes restless vassals stop testing you. He trained until sweat and dust were a second skin. He led sieges, pushed through breaches, and gave orders with the calm certainty of someone born for command. And the more he proved himself, the more one question started to rot at the center of him. Why didn't his father trust him? Henry had always kept a tight grip on everything: lands, courts, sheriffs, castles, even his own sons. Henry called it prudence, Richard called it a cage, and in Aquitaine, a cage doesn't hold a predator for long. It only teaches it where the bars are. The letters that came down from Henry didn't feel like guidance, they felt like control. Like a father reaching across mountains and rivers to remind his son, nothing here is truly yours until I say so. Richard could swallow a lot. He could swallow danger, he could swallow hardship, he could swallow blood, but he couldn't swallow that. And then, across the chessboard of France, another player learned how to push exactly where Henry was weakest: Philip II. Philip wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, he didn't need to be. He was young, disciplined, and patient in a way Henry almost couldn't understand. Because Henry had built his power through motion, through speed, through pressure, through never stopping long enough for opponents to breathe. Philip did the opposite. He waited. And when the moment was right, he offered Richard something that felt like oxygen: recognition. Not a father's praise, not a temporary honor, real acknowledgement. The kind that says, you are not a tool, you are a ruler. It didn't happen in a public hall with trumpets. It happened quietly, the way the most dangerous alliances usually happen, over candles and maps, with voices low and expressions controlled. Philip didn't need to flatter Richard like a fool. He only needed to name the truth Richard already lived with every day. A great warrior reduced to a subordinate, a prince treated like a boy, a duke whose victories still weren't enough to earn freedom from his father's hand. And Philip made the offer that turned irritation into betrayal. Why obey an aging king who refuses to name you properly when France is willing to treat you as the heir you believe you are? Richard didn't accept because he was naive. He accepted because it solved a problem Henry refused to solve. And Henry felt it almost immediately. First as rumor, then as uncomfortable silence at court, then as reports from men Henry trusted, saying that Richard had been seen too often at Philip's side, speaking too closely, sharing too much. Henry had always understood people. He could smell disloyalty the way a hunting hound smells blood.
And when he realized the truth, when he realized his strongest son was slipping into France's orbit, something cold settled into his chest that no fire could warm. He summoned Richard. He confronted him in stone rooms lit by candlelight. And the argument wasn't the kind that ends with a clean answer. It was the kind that exposes a lifetime of injury. Henry spoke like a king who believed the realm was always one mistake away from collapsing. He spoke of stability, of inheritance, of responsibility, of danger. He spoke as if holding power tightly was love, because in Henry's mind, letting go meant chaos. Richard listened like a man who had already decided that chaos was preferable to being controlled forever. To Henry, Richard's impatience looked like recklessness. To Richard, Henry's caution looked like fear, and neither could admit that the other might be partly right. The tragedy is that Henry didn't only fear losing territory, he feared losing the one thing he had built his identity around: control. He feared becoming Stephen. He feared the return of the civil war he had witnessed as a child. He feared a future where the kingdom slipped into anarchy again because a king let emotion overrule discipline. So he tried to handle Richard the same way he handled everything else, with pressure, with rules, with strategic restraint. But a son isn't a sheriff, a son isn't a baron, a son doesn't respond to royal discipline the way the realm does, because a son carries pride like a second skeleton. And Richard's pride was made of iron. Then the war moved from letters and whispers into marching columns. The borderlands of Normandy filled with men in mail and cloaks, horses and wagons, banners snapping under gray skies. Henry positioned his forces, trying to block Philip's advances, trying to force a decisive engagement, the kind of open battle that could end everything in a single brutal day. That was Henry's style. He respected clarity, he respected finality. Philip refused to give it to him. Every time the two forces neared the edge of a pitched battle, Philip pulled back, not in panic, in control. A disciplined withdrawal, a calculated refusal. He denied Henry the heroic moment, the clean test of strength, and replaced it with something Henry hated: slow erosion. It was infuriating, and it was brilliant. Because Henry could win a skirmish, he could capture supplies, he could take a castle here and there, but he couldn't land the knockout blow. And in war, especially in the kind of war Philip was fighting, time matters more than courage. Henry was aging. His body was no longer the weapon it had been. There were moments when pain bent him in half, and he waved away physicians like he could command his flesh into obedience. He rode anyway, he worked anyway, he forced himself upright anyway. Because stopping felt like losing. And Richard, meanwhile, grew more confident. He rode beside Philip under banners that should never have shared the same wind. He watched Normandy's fortresses in the distance, and he no longer looked like Henry's son, he looked like Henry's replacement. That is what finally breaks a king, not the sword, not the spear, not even the enemy army. It's the realization that the future has turned its face away from you. There is a moment, quiet, almost cruel, when Henry studies his maps by candlelight and moves wooden markers as if the pieces still obey him. England, Normandy, Aquitaine, castles, roads, alliances. He shifts one marker back into line, and then his hand stops, because he understands in that small silence that a human being cannot be moved the way a token can. Richard is not a piece. Richard is a will, and that will has chosen its direction. The war continues. Messengers ride through rain. Couriers carry sealed letters like weapons. Armies assemble and disassemble. Castles prepare for siege. The system Henry built still functions because it's strong, but Henry himself is weakening. And the shadow of Thomas Becket still hangs over the realm like incense that never fully clears. In Canterbury, the shrine is busy. Candles burn. Pilgrims kneel.
The story of a king who once spoke in anger and birthed martyrdom still shapes how people feel about royal power. Henry had built order to prevent chaos, and yet here he is, surrounded again by the forces that create chaos: ambition, betrayal, succession, fear.
The Loire Valley looks peaceful from a distance. Rolling green hills, a silver river, vineyards and stone villages tucked into the land like they've always been there. But in the summer of 1189, that beauty is just a backdrop for collapse. Because Henry II, the man who built an empire by refusing to stop moving, is finally being forced to stop. The road to Chinon is lined with what war leaves behind: burned timber, blackened beams, smoke lifting from ruined homes, families carrying what they can on their backs. The kind of scenes Henry has spent his whole life trying to prevent. The kind of scenes that remind him of childhood, of the anarchy, of England when the crown was too weak to hold anything together. Now it's happening again, and this time it's happening to him. Henry rides through drizzle and mud with a tight, disciplined escort. His banner droops in the wet wind. His soldiers are exhausted. His horses step carefully in ruts, because even animals can feel when a campaign has turned sour. Henry's face, lined, older, drawn tight with pain, doesn't show panic, but it does show strain, the kind that comes from fighting on two fronts at once, against an external enemy and against time inside his own body. When Chinon finally rises ahead, massive stone walls on a rocky spur above the river, it should feel like safety. Instead, it feels like a cage. Inside the gatehouse, torches hiss against wet stone, boots echo in corridors. The castle is busy, but the busyness is quiet, controlled, like everyone is afraid of making the wrong sound at the wrong moment. Henry moves down the halls with a slight limp, hand brushing the wall now and then, not for drama, but because balance is starting to cost him effort. In his chamber, the world shrinks to candlelight and parchment. A map sits on a table, edges curled from heat and years. England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine. Once, those names meant momentum. Now they feel like burdens stacked on a weak chest. Letters arrive, reports arrive, terms arrive, and then the emissaries arrive. They don't burst in like conquerors. They come politely, formally. Damp cloaks, mud on boots, bows measured to the precise angle that says, "We respect you, but we've come to collect." They place the treaty terms in front of Henry. Paper doesn't weigh much, but in that room it lands like a stone. Henry reads in silence. His eyes move quickly because he's always been quick, but the speed doesn't change what the words mean. Castles lost, concessions made, the succession reshaped under pressure. The realm he built is being carved while he still breathes. Then another document appears. Not a treaty, not a negotiation, a list. The names of men who have turned against him. At first, it's almost expected. Some nobles have always been restless, some loyalties were always purchased, and anything purchased can be repurchased. A few names Henry might even shrug at, if his body still had enough strength to shrug. But as the list continues, the room tightens. Henry sits very still. His fingers interlace and then separate again, because his hands can't decide whether to be calm or furious. His ring catches candlelight on the table. Somewhere outside, rain taps a shutter like a slow, patient countdown. And then the clerk reaches the end. There is a pause, small, human, hesitant, before the final name is read. John, his youngest son, the one Henry had protected, the one he had planned for, the one he had trusted as the last piece of his blood that would stay in his corner. He doesn't shout. He doesn't throw the table. He doesn't erupt the way people imagine medieval kings erupting. He just collapses inward, shoulders sinking slightly, breath catching, a hand tightening on the chair arm, not to make a threat, but to keep himself upright. The look on his face is not simply anger. It's the look of a man realizing that even the people he loved as family have been treating him like a fading asset. And then, because Henry is still Henry, the machinery takes over. He reaches for the treaty. His hand trembles, but he forces control. The wax is warmed, the seal is pressed, the document is pushed across the table to the waiting hands of the men who came to receive it. The act is ceremonial and devastating. It's not a battlefield defeat. It's worse. It's the formal acceptance that the world has moved on without him. After the envoys leave, the chamber empties. The noises of the castle continue at a distance. Footsteps, murmurs, the occasional clink of metal. But Henry is alone with the most dangerous silence of all. The silence that comes after you finally understand you can't fix this. He tries to stand. His knees refuse him for a moment. He pushes on the table edge, then sinks back down, breathing hard, as if his own body is delivering its verdict. The physicians hover with cups of herbs and cloths. The priest stands near the crucifix, waiting. Henry waves people away when he can. When he can't, he tolerates them with the exhausted irritation of a man who hates being reminded that he's mortal. The days blur. Candles burn down. Wax drips and hardens. Light shifts through the narrow window slit. Dust motes float in the beam like tiny, indifferent witnesses. Henry stares at the map sometimes, as if he could move the pieces back into place by force of will. Once, his hand reached towards a marker, then stopped mid-air and fell back. Because the truth is clear now. You can't rearrange the future like a chessboard when the future is made of people. The end, when it comes, is quiet. Henry's breath slows. His eyes half open and then soften. A crucifix is offered. His fingers brush it once, not as a miracle, not as a drama, just as a final human gesture. Then the hand falls back on the linen. A loyal attendant closes his eyes, and Henry II is gone. Outside that room, the world immediately begins to move the way it always does after a king dies. The news travels through corridors like smoke. Guards straighten, stewards whisper orders, messengers prepare to ride. Henry's body is washed and wrapped. His signet ring is removed and placed in a small box, because power, at the end, always becomes objects. A bier is lifted, and the weight is real. Men adjust their grips, boots slipping slightly on wet stone before bracing again. The funeral procession moves out through Henon's gatehouse, down towards the river roads, towards Fontevraud Abbey, where kings and queens will lie side by side in stone. In the abbey, candles burn and incense hangs in the air. Monks stand in lines. The coffin is lowered with ropes that tighten under load, men controlling the descent carefully so it doesn't jolt or sway. The finality is physical, unavoidable. And then the procession disperses and the abbey returns to quiet. Elsewhere, the living react. In Richard's camp, a messenger kneels. Richard listens. He doesn't smile. If there is satisfaction, it's buried. He gives a single controlled nod, as if accepting a crown that came with a taste of ashes. In Paris, Philip reads the news and folds the parchment neatly, calm as ever. His victory is not a cheer, it's a stillness. And Eleanor, after years behind stone walls, steps back into light, older, unbroken, eyes sharp. She inhales once, as if tasting freedom, and moves forward into the new reign. Here's the final irony of Henry II. The empire he built, those vast lands, will fracture. Borders will shift, castles will fall. His sons will fight, and their sons will fight after them. But the system Henry carved into England outlives him. And that, more than any battlefield, may be the real monument of Henry II.
Stands, stone and solemn, waiting for another king. Inside the abbey, candlelight shimmers against cold pillars, incense hangs in the air like a veil, nobles gather in fur and fine cloth, and the clergy move with practiced calm, because this is not simply a ceremony, it's a declaration to the entire realm. The crown is still alive. Richard walks the aisle with a warrior's posture, straight-backed, controlled, already famous before the crown ever touches his head. When the gold is lifted from the altar and set onto him, it isn't only a moment of holiness, it's a moment of transformation. The Plantagenet lion has a new face.
Outside, the crowd surges and cheers, guards hold the line, banners snap in the wind. England watches its new king and thinks, for a brief heartbeat, that history is clean, that a reign ends, another begins, and the world moves forward like a well-oiled hinge. But history is never clean, because even as Richard is crowned, the shadow of Henry II lies across everything he touches. You can see it in the rooms that don't make songs. In the chancery, scribes keep writing, quills scratch parchment, sand is scattered to dry ink, wax is warmed and pressed with a seal, orders are copied, stacked, tied with cord, and passed into a messenger's satchel. This is not glory. This is administration. This is the machine Henry built. Henry's empire of land may be about to splinter, but Henry's empire of habit, of record, procedure, and royal authority keeps breathing. In small towns and manor halls, judges sit on benches and hear disputes that would once have been settled by a baron's mood or a sword's edge. Villagers stand with their caps in their hands, talking about boundary stones and stolen livestock and old grudges. A verdict is given. People leave, unhappy or relieved, but alive. And that matters, because it means something has changed in England, not perfectly, not instantly, but deeply. A generation ago, a man could be hanged in a ditch because a soldier was bored. Now, more often than not, there is at least the idea that guilt must be shown, not simply assumed. That idea is Henry II's true legacy, not a castle, not a victory, an expectation. Meanwhile, in Canterbury, another legacy brines brighter than any crown. Becket's shrine glows with candles, incense clouds the air. Pilgrims press forward, mud on their boots, staffs in their hands, hope in their eyes. They kneel, they touch cold stone, they leave coins and rings and whispered prayers. Whether miracles truly happen there is almost beside the point. What matters is that people believe the place is holy, and belief, especially in the medieval world, is a kind of power that outlives swords. Thomas Becket is dead, and yet he still influences the living. He is still shaping the story of kingship itself. He is still reminding every ruler in England that there is a line the crown cannot cross without consequence. And Richard, warrior that he is, understands something about consequence, even if he refuses to speak about it. Soon, the new king looks outward, away from England, toward the horizon that has always called a men like him. Ships gather at the ports, sailcloth snaps in sea wind, ropes creak under tension, barrels roll across wooden planks, knights in mail and surcoats step aboard with steady, practiced weight, adjusting their footing as the deck shifts beneath them. Richard stands on the ship's rail and scans the sea as if it were a battlefield waiting to be conquered. When the fleet finally leaves the quay, the motion is slow at first, wood and water resisting each other, then inevitable. Sails fill, oars dip, the ships pull away, and England grows smaller behind them. To the world, this is the heroic part, the Lionhearts setting out. But beneath the heroics, Richard is still using Henry's tools. He may chase battle and legend, but the letters still need sealing, the orders still need copying, the money still needs accounting. Even a crusade runs on the kind of system Henry perfected. So while Richard becomes a story men sing, Henry remains a structure men rely on, often without even knowing it. And then there's Eleanor. For years, she was a queen behind stone, a presence contained by locks and guards, and the stubborn will of a husband who couldn't allow her to move freely. When Henry dies, those doors open, not just physically, but politically. Eleanor steps back into the world with the calm of someone who has survived the worst kind of captivity, the captivity of being underestimated. She walks through corridors again, speaks to men again, reads reports, points once at a map location, and lets that one gesture carry 1,000 meanings. She has buried a husband, she will crown a son, she will watch the dynasty continue without the man who tried to control every piece of it. If Henry II was the builder, Eleanor becomes the keeper of what remains. And Henry himself? Henry lies in stone now. At Fontevraud, candles flicker beside his tomb. A monk replaces a taper, and the flame catches. That small, ordinary action is almost cruel in its simplicity. Kings fall, and still someone must keep the candles burning.
In quiet rooms, monks copy chronicles. In archives, clerks lift parchment rolls tied with cord, stack them carefully, align their edges, and file them away. The seal impressions remain crisp, the ink remains dark. History is being fixed in place. And even that is part of Henry's world. Because Henry understood that power does not last if it isn't recorded, if it isn't repeated, if it doesn't become routine. There is a strange, almost poetic contrast as the years roll forward. On one side, you have Richard, the king of banners, ships, and battlefield fame, a man who will be remembered as a warrior first, ruler second. On the other side, you have Henry, the king whose most lasting weapon was paperwork, courts, procedures, a way of doing things that could survive even when the man himself could not. And the land remembers both, but not in the same way. Richard's memory lives in songs, in heroic images, in the glint of steel and the snap of a lion banner against the sky. Henry's memory lives in quieter places. It lives in a judge walking into a small hall with a document case, in a clerk stamping wax on a writ, in a village dispute being heard instead of settled by violence, in the simple fact that ordinary people begin to expect that even power must explain itself. There is one final image that brings it all back to the beginning. A field in England, green again, with dew on the grass. The old gallows of Henry's childhood, the symbol of lawlessness, has rotted, collapsed, or become nothing more than a memory. Birds land where bodies once swung. The wind moves leaves instead of ropes. And somewhere nearby, in a timber hall lit by torches, a judge reads from a parchment. No king sits in the room, no crown is visible, yet the law is there, alive in the ritual of procedure. The crowd listens. The verdict is given. People file out, not because they fear a lord's sword, but because the matter has been decided, at least for today, by something they recognize as authority. That is the end of Henry II's story. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not even a tomb. A courtroom. A place where the strongest man in the room is no longer the one with the sharpest blade, but the one who can speak the rules and make everyone else accept them. And in that sense, quiet, stubborn, and lasting, Henry Plantagenet finally gets what he wanted as a child in the mud. A kingdom that doesn't have to hang a man just to prove it still exists.